Hi, warm greetings. I'm Dr. Raasiq. Welcome to the world of psychiatry and psychology. Today we are going to talk about learning. There are basically two types of learning. There are classical conditioning and the operant conditioning. So, we'll talk in detail about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning basically deals with involuntary responses. So, we'll talk about the famous experiment done by the Russian physicist Dr. Ian Pavlov. So what he did was, he used to present food to the dog and the dog used to salivate. So that was the unconditioned stimulus given to the dog. So after a few days, he got this idea, now let me ring the bell when I'm presenting the food to the dog. Now that is the conditioned stimulus he was trying to condition to the dog. So after a few days, now the dog used to salivate even when the bell was ringing and when the food was not presented to it. So this dog was now classically conditioned to the stimulus called the ringing of the bell. Now after a few days, now again Pavlov stopped ringing of the bell and now the food was presented. Now the dog only used to salivate when the food was presented and not salivate when the ringing of the bell was present. So basically he broke the conditioned stimuli, which is the ringing of the bell. So this was the famous experiment of classical conditioning conducted by Dr. Ian Pavlov. So in classical conditioning, you basically deal with involuntary responses. And what else do you have in classical conditioning? In classical conditioning, there is a stimuli followed by a response. So there is stimulus first, followed by a response. So that is classical conditioning. Now, we'll talk a little about operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, there are positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. So operant conditioning basically deals with voluntary responses. And here it slightly differs from that of classical conditioning in a way that in operant conditioning you have a response generated followed by a stimuli. So the response, which is the behavior, is basically because the person or the being is anticipating a stimuli. So there can be increased behavior or there can be decreased behavior. So if there is increased behavior for a stimuli, that is called positive reinforcement. And if the behavior increases for a decrease in the stimuli, that is called basically negative reinforcement. And when the behavior decreases for an increased stimuli, that is punishment. And when the behavior decreases for a decrease in stimuli, it's basically called extinction. So that's in brief about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So that brings an end to learning. I'll see you in the next class. Now, we'll talk about ego defenses. Now, what is ego? What are the defenses? Basically, every human being is born with a superego and an id. Now, what is the superego? What is this id? Now, id is a condition wherein your subconscious mind forces you to be more of a neutral person, more of a socially withdrawn person. And your superego is what makes you feel disinhibited. So your superego compels you to do the things that come into your mind, irrespective of others' beliefs and others' cultural rights. So that is your superego. So an amalgamation and a really comfortable balance between the id and the superego is what forms your ego. So you all need to have this ego in order to pursue your life. So if there is an imbalance between your id or your superego, you either tend to be socially more withdrawn or you tend to be socially more aggressive and you tend to be more antisocial kind of a person. Okay, so that is your id and your superego, and a mixture of your id and superego is what balances you out to lead a comfortable life in the society which doesn't violate the rights and laws of the land and of the other people. So that is ego. So ego defense mechanisms, when a person or when a child or an adult or any human being is put under tremendous stress, so each person basically opts out a defense mechanism in order to cope with that stress. So ego defenses are nothing but coping mechanisms. In order to deal with a particular kind of a stress, a person uses these ego defense mechanisms in order to deal with that particular stress. So broadly, there are two types of ego defenses. There can be immature type of defenses, or there can be mature type of defenses. Now we'll talk about each one of the immature and mature defenses in detail in the following lecture. Now, denial. Now, assuming this box to be your subconscious mind, now this is the stressful circumstance, and there's this news, and the patient don't want this information to be accessed by her subconscious mind. So denial is basically you're not letting the information go into your mind. Now, denial is a little different from repression and suppression. Now, we'll talk about what suppression is and what repression is. Now, in repression, a person who has this hard circumstance or a difficult circumstance or a stressful event, he basically knows that that event has occurred to him, but he doesn't want to access that information from his subconscious mind now in due course of time. Now, he is choosing to avoid it subconsciously. So that is basically your repression. And if a person chooses to consciously prevent an event or a memory that will put him under a stressful circumstance, that is basically suppression. Now, if I'll depict repression, now if again this is your subconscious mind, there is entry of an event into your subconscious mind in repression, but there is no access back of this particular event or a stressful circumstance back again in the future. Okay, so that is basically your repression. Now, how is it different from suppression? In suppression, if this is your subconscious mind, there is entry as well as there can be an exit of a stressful circumstance, but basically you choose not to bring this back. So this is your conscious effort, this is your unconscious effort. So if you consciously choose not to bring up a stressful event in your life, you're choosing to cope with that stress using suppression as your ego defense. And if you do the same thing subconsciously, then that is basically your regression. If you choose not to bring back a stressful circumstance, now if you choose that consciously, that is suppression. And if you do that subconsciously, that's basically repression. So these are the three defense mechanisms which do look like alike, but there are subtle variations between denial, between repression and suppression. In denial, you basically choose not to take up a stressful circumstance into your mind. You don't tend to accept the fact. That is denial. In suppression, you consciously put away the stressful circumstance. So that is suppression. And if you do the same thing subconsciously, that basically is what is your regression as an ego defense. So we'll talk about more immature defenses. Now, displacement. When do you use displacement as an ego defense? So, channelizing emotions or feelings under a stressful circumstance from a person who's at a higher level of hierarchy to a person who is at a lower level of hierarchy is basically what's your displacement. Now, like an example, I'll tell you. Now, there's this person who has this lovely dog, and there's this person who is also an employee at an office. Now, he's the most sincere person. Now, if the boss has yelled out at him for some probably no reason of his, now what kind of stressful circumstance is this person having? He's basically all emotionally disconnected because of the yelling of the boss. Now, he can't show his anger towards his boss because obviously he is his boss. Now, what this person will do is he will channelize that kind of anger and all those emotions that he has towards his boss onto his dog. So that is displacement. So channelizing the emotions from a person who is at a higher level of hierarchy to a person who is at a lower level of hierarchy is basically what your displacement is all about. So that is one of the ways to cope with a stressful situation. That is displacement. Now, we'll talk about dissociation.